Alrighty. Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Vogt, and I'm the Transportation Demand Program Manager for Movability, the only transportation management agency in Central Texas. And with me is Andrea Villalobos.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea, and I am the planning manager with the City of San Marcos. So my job is sort of around long-range planning in the city and thinking about sort of the future of planning in our community. But today I'm also sort of speaking as a bike rider and a member of an organization who's sort of also grappling with these challenges of different forms of transportation used by their employees.
All righty, let's do it. So we're talking today about, Bike Month is over, and why should employers promote bicycling and active and non-automotive transportation? The short answer is that employers and employees can have huge cost savings in promoting non-automotive transportation and active transportation in particular. But kind of digging into this, what are the costs for exclusively promoting automotive travel? Next slide, please.
Cars are quite expensive for employers, and that's something that we wanted to kind of hone in on. Car parking infrastructure is both initially and over time expensive. Surface parking stalls typically cost about $6,000 to $10,000, which is just for those initial costs. And we sort of, in the planning world, kind of see that on the development side as kind of working with applicants on their parking structures when they're doing new builds. This also doesn't really take into consideration construction and maintenance. So most parking lots need maintenance about every 5 to 10 years, and they'll need to be completely repaved about every 20 years. A parking structure itself, so actually constructing something like the image here on the screen, is actually even more expensive. And so even if an employer who's actually leasing the space, they still do kind of carry that burden of that cost through that infrastructure of parking through their rent. For a comparison, bicycle infrastructure and bicycle parking is going to be a lot cheaper. So a typical outdoor bicycle rack might cost around $200, and even sort of upgrading an existing indoor space that you might have in a building to a bike room is typically going to cost less than actually creating even 1 to 2 parking spots with the numbers that I mentioned.
And those numbers are all for at grade. So just a surface lot, the parking structure, like in the picture, like Andrea mentioned, is way more expensive. And then Andrea, do you want to so why do most places have so much auto parking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of putting my planning hat on, a lot of it actually has to do with what municipalities require for parking. So a lot of times there's always a section in the code that says, if you're going to build this use, you have to provide this amount of parking spaces, usually per unit, if it's like a multifamily structure, or per square footage of building. So planning and sort of municipal codes can drive this. So that's something to really kind of pay attention to, is really thinking about best practices and working with your planners or municipalities or organizations to kind of think about the cost. And why it's important for us as planners to think about that is that's requiring something to be constructed that then impacts the built environment. So impacts the way the cities are being designed and kind of what's being placed on the ground.
So we do have a little bit of it looks like we got a little jumbled up in the slide order. I was looking at the notes for a different slide, so there is something that we should probably think about for that. Hang on, let me get oriented here. I guess that's the beauty and curse of not being live. So, okay, it looks like, yeah, could you just advance the slide? Thank you. So this is the parking structure that we were discussing. You know, long story short, it's very expensive to store cars. There's a lot of municipal code that requires a lot of car storage, probably typically in excess of what is actually needed. You know, commonly the parking requirements are called parking minimums, and sometimes you'll see them referred to that way in the media. So just be aware of that. So let's advance the slide. It's pulled up here. Alrighty. Okay. So let's talk. So we've talked a little bit about some of the costs for employers for promoting exclusively automotive travel. Let's talk a little bit about the costs for employees. So in my mind, the main benefit of automotive travel is convenience. You know, you get in your car, you go wherever, you park. You know, in America, you're typically going to be able to park right wherever you're going, and then you're done. That's your trip. So people who are used to that have, you know, that's kind of how they're sort of conditioned to get around. So, but let's think of just for a second about the cost to an individual or an employee. So you have to purchase the car. You know, then if it's a new car, and even if it's a used car, but definitely with a new car, the moment you buy it and drive it off the lot, it depreciates in value. So that's a cost. So not only is it there the upfront cost, there's the loss in value inherent in the depreciation. Then you have to keep, you know, keep it running. That requires fuel, that requires maintenance. There's some regulatory stuff, you know, you have to register it. There's a liability component. So, you know, if you run into something, or hopefully, you know, God forbid, run into someone, you know, that's a lot of liability. That can be a huge cost. There's, you know, there's also, this is a little bit more, there's a community cost too. You know, there's a separation inherent in single occupancy vehicle trips. You know, you're not interacting with people directly when you're in a car. You're interacting with the people, you know, that are you know, you're interacting with other car drivers when you're driving, and that separation can create all kinds of really weird and interesting behavior. Like, for, you know, I think one of the most typical things that people would think of in this scenario is road rage. You know, people getting, you know, it's very, very interesting. So, you know, there's a lot of cost, and a lot of people don't really think about these costs in the calculus when they're deciding to drive. They just, you know, are conditioned to get in their car wherever they're going. I actually had a neighbor once who would drive even if he was only going 2 or 3 blocks away. It was wild to me. So just be aware that that is kind of the transportation paradigm in North America. And I think is definitely something to consider with people's travel behaviors and the conditioning that they have. Shall we advance the slide, please? So.
Yeah, and sort of, I think, alluding to what you were saying, Alex, is I think some of those health concerns that come with just the built environment in general. So, you know, cars and their associated infrastructure are sort of by design not a healthy component of our built environment. A lot of times I just like to think about, you know, the way that cities were designed prior to the car. And those are the places we like to go to. We go on vacation in these gorgeous cities where everyone's sort of a tourist and walking around, and you sort of enjoy that. And we've really kind of, since the introduction of the car, we've been sort of forced to change the way that we design those cities. So kind of at a more tangible level, obviously tailpipe emissions contain toxic and cancer causing compounds. And so, the increase in vehicular infrastructure continues to cause less than ideal impacts in our community. And it also, just thinking about it from a more land use perspective, that also means that people can live really far away and they're using their car to sort of get to their job, right? But that also means that you're sort of displacing people and disconnecting people from their place of employment. They might not be anywhere near where they live. And I know that this scene right here is a reality for a lot of people who are trying to get to their job. That also just means not just to your work, but you're having to drive further to get to your grocery store, to parks, or to take your kid to school. And so the commutes are longer, and you're doing it typically by yourself, solely in your one vehicle. I think another kind of quote I wanted to share is just speaking a little bit more broadly, right? From the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. About half of all American adults, which is 117 million people, have one or more preventable chronic diseases. 7 of the 10 most chronic diseases are favorably influenced by regular physical activity. Nearly 80% of adults are not meeting those key guidelines, which would be like aerobic or muscle strengthening activity to help improve some of those pieces. And so thinking about it again from kind of more monetarily, that's linked to 117 billion in annual healthcare. That's also about 10% of premature mortality. So this is a very real thing that you can look at with statistics, but I think it's also just something that we are interacting with by talking to our coworkers and to our neighbors. We're all sort of interacting with this idea of our daily lives and that balance of work, health, home, play. We're at work, we're sitting here for 8 hours a day a lot of times, and then sort of rushing to the gym or like rushing to get that physical activity. And that takes time to get across town, to go back to where you live, and just how land use and transportation are so interconnected. And so this, as employers, this is going to impact you all, because these are your employees, and their sort of mental health will impact productivity. And that also really plays a part in sort of how a job is going to perform. And so kind of thinking about that as a foundation, you can look at statistics, but you can also just talk to people and understand these are things that they are dealing with in their everyday lives that might take away from why they are choosing not to have that fitness in their life, because we haven't really set up a system for them for it to be convenient to be fit and to exercise and to walk and ride a bike.
Sure. And so just for just to add to that, from an employer's perspective, there's, this lack of physical activity inherent in car travel can definitely affect the bottom line, in that, if people are more active, they're less likely to take sick days, they're more likely to be happy at work, they can really benefit from something that will also save the organization money. So it is, and typically they will be the people that I know that that ride their bikes, most of them are elected bike riders. They choose, they have cars, they have other options, but they choose to ride, and they're happy to do that because it makes them feel better. So it's a choice that seems like a win-win for everybody. But let's dig a little deeper. So what we're trying to do here is, we've established that there's some issues with exclusive automotive travel, but now we kind of want to dig into how we promote active and non-SOV transportation. So when I say SOV, I mean single occupancy vehicles. So we are definitely very much in favor of people sharing rides, because that's way more efficient than someone driving alone. But, so how do we've kind of broken our strategies into how we promote active transportation into 3 categories. There's infrastructure, which kind of is defined as anything that is that the employer or organization can build or buy or, you know, provide for their employees. That's a physical thing that will help reduce barriers to active transportation. There are policies that those are typically, they can be low or no cost, or sometimes they can be cost a little bit, but they can all typically, the more you spend, the higher the return on investment. And then kind of related to all of those are programs. So kind of the difference for me there is a program policy is something that employee can kind of opt into, or it's a rule that the employer can change to make it easier for an employee. An employer can change to make it easier for an employee to use active or alternative transportation. But a program is something the employer, the organization sets up to make it, incentivize the use of active or non-SOV transportation. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and so as Alex mentioned, infrastructure for this webinar is really defined as anything built by the employer for active transportation. So we kind of have 3 examples here, sort of 3 tiers to that type of infrastructure. The first thing is just bike racks. Good bike racks are great. That's just a place for you as an employee to lock up your bike. And they really are an encouragement for active transportation. If a bike rack doesn't exist, most bicyclists will still find a way to secure their bike, but it's probably going to lead to suboptimal conditions both for the employer and the employee. If there's no infrastructure, an employee, I might just put my bike wherever I feel like is maybe the safest place, but not necessarily where my employer might want me to put that bike. The main downside to bike racks, though, are they aren't great from the perspective of security. So given that you do have to actually bring your own lock, right, and lock up your bike to a bike rack, there aren't a lot of bike locks that are going to be like fully unable to be broken. So a U-lock can be cut in under 30 seconds, and a cable lock, which is sort of the simplest, and also it's the cheapest bike lock. So it might actually be what most sort of new bike riders are using, is just a cable lock. Those can actually be chopped in about 10 seconds. So that's sort of an even larger discouragement for someone to ride because they don't even have great ways to keep it secure.
And just to jump in super quick, I was in charge of bike parking at a big university, and one of my jobs was the management of bike parking. And so I personally have cut a lot of bike locks, and the U-locks are not, they're way more secure than a cable lock, but if someone has an angle grinder, they're not secure. And cable locks it would take us longer to put the cable lock in the jaws of the bolt cutter than it would actually take to cut them. So it's just, they're not secure. They're it's the kind of, for me, it's the kind of option I only would use as a last resort, or if I can still see my bike.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's interesting that you fully understand also how easy it is to remove these, which, not most people don't. I wouldn't know how easy it is to break it. I think it's a lock, it should be fine. But kind of having that knowledge is helpful, I think, also for the employer and to understand the dynamics. So the next one on the list here is just better bike lockers. So it can be another solution. There's an image here of what a bike locker looks like. It's hard for someone to actually take a bike because they can't necessarily view the bike. It's just a box. And so it's going to be more secure. One downside we did just sort of want to point out is that it can take up a lot of sidewalk space. So you're having to really think out and plan where that might be located on your property. And then just depending on the design, it could be an issue. If they're large enough, somebody could actually be occupying one of those. You can get in, you're rolling your bike into an actual physical locker that can be closed. The best solution, though, and the best recommendation that we have is actually having an indoor space. And that's currently what I use at the city of San Marcos for my bike. So it's a place that's going to be within the building, a designated space to actually have bikes. It can be what's called a sort of a room that has been designated to have bikes, or it can just be a policy that you are okay with your employees bringing their bike inside. First off, it's a benefit to the employee because it cuts down on the risk of my bike being stolen, particularly if there's an individual coming from a far distance. They might be doing it on a bike that they feel like will get them there faster, which might be a more expensive bike. Or just if that's all you have, you definitely don't want your bike to be stolen. In San Marcos, just providing a little example, we actually don't have a designated room that's, all fitted out with all of these amenities. It's actually just underneath our staircase in the city. So it's not going to be the best case scenario, but I feel comfortable leaving my bikes there, knowing that they're not going to be in the rain, that there's some oversight, and that it's sort of, I'm not the only one putting it there. That's already sort of this policy that that's a safe place for me to put it, and that I have kind of the approval of my employer to have it there.
Sure. And that's a really interesting intersectionality between policies and infrastructure. It's like, if you can't, if you're in an employer in a building that's leased, you may not have the latitude to actually add physical elements to the structure, may not be able to install bike racks or lockers, but you can change your policies to allow people to bring, for instance, their bikes inside. And it doesn't necessarily, and anything that's applicable to a bike is probably applicable to other types of mobility device. So let's actually advance the slide. So for instance, a skateboard, a policy that would let you bring in skateboards, or you can provide your employees a skateboard rack. I've seen these more at, places that employ, younger people. But I do know that, for instance, the old planning director at the city of San Marcos rode a skateboard. In fact, he still does. I saw him just the other day, rides a skateboard all over around town. And then also providing storage for people who are using active or non-automotive transportation. Because, for instance, if you are a diehard transit rider, you're going to be riding on days when it's not bright and sunny. So if you get soaked on the way to work, walking in, it's nice to be able to put your things other places. And kind of like I alluded to, there's other types of infrastructure or policy. So for instance, being able to bring your electric scooter inside, bringing any kind of electric mobility device, like some of the one wheels or hoverboards, those are all things that make it easier for people to not drive exclusively.
So another component to infrastructure is actually showers. So that's really that next level of encouragement. It enables an employee to take longer trips on their bike, and it also makes hot weather commuting much more viable. Although right now it would be really great to have, because we're in the middle of a pretty significant heat wave, which is a stark difference from what I was doing, what I was experiencing as a bike rider this time last year. It's very dramatic, and how that really does change year by year, depending on what the weather is doing. Most restrooms are pretty easy to retrofit as well, to kind of add a shower. I do know, from sort of the city perspective, we do have employees who are working outside. Our public services department does work extensively outside. So it is nice that these sort of facilities have been built into a city organization. Although it definitely, I think, leans more towards larger and sort of nicer facilities for the men's restroom versus the women's restroom, just because there isn't as many of those employees in public service in a lot of ways. So I think kind of thinking about it from also what the needs of everyone are at your organization is really important. I do have examples of, some of my staff that they'll go on a bike ride during lunch, and they just jump in the river and that's great. And here in San Marcos, we have a river really close to our organization. They can just pop right back into work and it's no problem. And, for me as a woman, I feel like that's not necessarily something that is an option just because, I'm coming in and I've got meetings and I just don't particularly feel comfortable with that. So I think having those conversations with your organization are important to just better understand what everyone's needs are, to just make sure that you're finding solutions for everyone, I think is an important piece. So giving employees that flexibility and having that good service for everyone is going to be great. And employees are going to feel good that you're asking them as well, and understanding what their options are.
Absolutely. And, these showers don't necessarily, they can, this can be part of a recruitment and retention strategy for employees too. And it doesn't, these showers also can benefit people that aren't, they will also probably benefit people who are not riding bikes or using active transportation. So if they wanted to work out at lunch, or like in Andrea's example, people who are working outside. And it may also be that these can fit into existing recruitment strategies, like say if you giving your employees a gym membership, that could be a really interesting sort of intersectionality where you can't build a shower, for instance, because your lease won't allow it, but you're providing a program where you are giving your employees a gym membership. But then, you have a policy where if they ride in, they can, come in 15 minutes late to take a shower at the gym that's down the street. There's some, the way to deal with kind of problems or impediments is to get creative. And there's a lot of different ways you can kind of make this easier for people. So just think about that as we're going through it. Next slide. So we are in the policies section. So kind of like we talked about, infrastructure is anything that's built. And the way I think about policies is anything that it's a rule or a policy that the employer creates to either make it easier, or a rule that's changed to make it reduce barriers to promote active and non-SOV transportation. So a really good one, in my opinion, is give people scheduling flexibility if they're going to be using active transportation. So, and this isn't something, it's like, hey, I rode my bike today, I need to come in late. It's like, this needs to be something that is a conversation between the employee and the supervisor, and it's predetermined. But those kind of incentives work. People want flexibility. And I know that one of the barriers towards especially transit, but also bicycling, is people are worried about not having the flexibility and convenience of driving. People are afraid basically that they won't be able to get where they need to be. So giving them some flexibility is a good way to address that. Another, in the same kind of vein, an emergency ride home program. If you live down the street from your place of work, it's no big deal to run home, whether you are walking, riding, or riding a bike or driving. But if you say work in South Austin and live in Pflugerville, that's a big barrier. So there are transit connections to Pflugerville to South Austin, but you might be afraid, especially if you have kids in school or maybe a medical condition, you may be concerned about how you would address a problem where you would need to leave quickly and get somewhere relatively quickly. So an emergency ride home program, which can be way simpler to set up than you might think. The guaranteed ride home program that Movability has set up is just using, you enroll, and then if someone needs an emergency ride home, they just take an Uber ride and then fill out a little form and we reimburse them. They have to qualify for it, and there's some policies for that, but that is something that you can do. Another policy that probably is a bit more of a program, but that's all right. another policy is you can charge for automotive parking. This is more if you were thinking about carrots and sticks. This is more of the stick side of incentivization. You're making it harder less convenient for people to drive. But, kind of like we talked about earlier in the presentation, there's a big cost to employers for automotive parking. And so letting the employees feel a little bit of that, I think, is completely appropriate. Free parking doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. It's just we're making it free for the end user. So it's definitely an extremely contentious issue. And I completely I worked in a department that managed paid parking for a large institution. And I know that it is not popular, but it is a really good way to incentivize non-automotive travel. And another way, you don't have to just charge for parking. You can be flexible with how you do that. It's like, hey, if you ride your bike 3 times a week, you get to drive for free, but everyone else has to pay. You can be creative with how you address it. And I definitely think I've even heard of organizations that they take the revenue generated by automotive parking, charging for automotive parking, and then they use that to fund incentive programs for people who are biking or using transit, which I think is really interesting. And sometimes it's like, they throw a pizza party or something for the people using biking or transit, but I've also seen it where they literally are just paying the people to bike and ride transit from the monies that are generated from the people who are paying to park. So that's definitely something to think about. And I think a little bit more, if you do want to incentivize non-automotive travel, but you might not want to charge for parking, you can also let people sort of get a parking cash out where they say, you're not going to be able to drive, but you'll get an extra $100 or $50 or whatever it is on your paycheck, and that's a way to kind of not penalize the people who have to drive, but reward the people who don't want to.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some programs, and then also I can provide just some kind of context for what is offered here in San Marcos. So programs are going to be any incentivization that's goal is to systematically encourage active transportation. One of the ways that I think it will have to be successful is you do need to think about that commute tracking. So like better understanding the data and getting that foundation of your workplace and from your employees, and that can kind of help you understand if these are working. But it can sort of be anything. So some of the common examples are going to be monetary incentives, which is essentially to pay employees to ride. And Alex was kind of talking a little bit about this. A variation of that might be additional paid time off, so that PTO incentivization. Another might be actually providing a stipend for active transportation expenses, which I think is actually a really interesting idea, because again, just like a car, having a bike and riding does still take maintenance of your bike and that kind of thing. And so again, that's something you can gather more from understanding your workplace culture and what the needs are of your employees. These types of things can really be rolled into something that I think employers already do, which is those like health and wellness programs. In San Marcos, we've had sort of these walk zombie challenges where we're having to go out and get a certain amount of steps, and we're competing with each other. And when that is going on, the entire city hall, there are just people walking in every direction because it gets really competitive and it becomes fun. And so I've sort of seen that success with these walking challenges that really can be translated into something a little bit more creative to have that bicycling foundation as well. And it's something that I would love to see in San Marcos in my workplace, because that's something that I'm doing. And it also again contributes to this larger culture of maybe you're riding a bike around your neighborhood that could kind of help create that next step to maybe let me try riding to work with somebody. Another example kind of wanted to mention was just You can get a certain amount of time a day or week for fitness to actually ride. So as an employee, you can sort of allocate, okay, you can have this amount of riding during your week, or letting people go home early. I think one thing to consider again is just the geography of where we are, but when the fall comes around, your employees might be biking pretty late at night, depending on how far they're going, or if they're just trying to get in their fitness ride in the evening. You're typically riding at night, which isn't going to be as safe. And a lot of those entry riders are not going to feel comfortable riding at night, whether that's in the morning or the evening, although sometimes it's, for my case right now, it's a lot cooler at night. But again, those are things that you can think of and sort of help create sort of unique programs related to those different contexts.
Yeah, and just to, jump in with my experience at my last job at Texas State University, we got 30 minutes every day for physical activity. And it was kind of hard to use because, you had to stay on campus. You also had to do your regular job. So it would have been great if, for example, you could say, hey, I'm going to spend I can come in at say 8:15 and then leave at 4:45 because I'm going to be commuting. So that would be an example of using an existing programming to promote non-automotive transportation. And then also, there doesn't, any of these examples, infrastructure or program, there may be people who can't, because of their situation, make the whole trip. So there's definitely kind of middle grounds that we can kind of talk about in just a second about how, we can give people options even if they have to drive. Okay, second, lost my notes here. I'm falling apart over here, guys. Hang on. Okay, so we're just talking about some common barriers to engagement. So I think that especially for biking, but also this applies to transit and possibly even some aspects of like carpooling or van pairing, is a lack of comfortable infrastructure. Most, even transit and possibly even van pool, they require some amount of walking or being in a public space. So if you don't have comfortable public infrastructure, I'm talking about bike lanes, street lighting, sidewalks, it's going to make it a barrier. And then, another thing to think about is if employees live an hour drive away, it can be a huge barrier towards being able to, use active transportation. And I think a part of that too is a lack of reliable transit connections. So, and then I know, we've mentioned a little bit in Central Texas, our main weather barrier right now is the heat. It's, for some people it is, it is unwise. It is not safe for people to be commuting in this heat. But there are lots of people who, I just want to make a caveat to that, is that there's lots of people who can commute just fine. It's just uncomfortable. So you just, you want to be really thoughtful of that. And then I know in other parts of the world, it's too cold some parts of the year to be outside, or it's very uncomfortable. So, but, just as an example, I know Minneapolis, they have many people who commute year round in, like quite literally, not just sub-zero, but, in the negative 10s, negative 20s degree temperatures. So there's definitely a way to mitigate all of these problems. So let's look into that.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing to what you said too, Alex, is that this idea of like lack of comfortable infrastructure too is also, and we'll talk about the different types of infrastructure, but not knowing how to navigate the infrastructure or what to do when your bike lane just goes away and now you're just in the street. And one of the ways I think that an employer can kind of help with some of that is just community around bike riding, and identifying who rides in your workplace and One of the things that I've done with some of my coworkers is a few of them have started to ride their bikes to work with me. And it really does take, just as it took for me, someone to help steward and facilitate that process. Like I needed somebody to kind of take my hand and help me walk through that door of riding, which meant group rides, like bike to breakfast. You know, I remember doing that when I first started at the city, and I was like, we're biking to breakfast. Like, I don't think I can do that. And a lot of times it's that community. So, you know, every employer is going to have that culture, that, you know, creating that culture for that, for your employees. And that can be kind of one of those components, is just helping build that community and teaching others how to handle that. Because it does take something that must be both watched and practiced.
So, and I just want to just kind of, jam on that, because that's something that I completely agree with. And it's a great plug for some of Movability's programming, because that is something we can help with. If you don't have a culture of biking in your organization, we can help develop some strategy, some planning, some marketing material to help with that. And then we can actually come and be those people to walk you through the door if that's what you want. We can plan events that are bicycling specific. We can work with whoever is most interested in your sort of employee base, and kind of help designate someone who can be that leader and get them trained with the knowledge about the best practices and how to do it and the best routes, and just really make it as successful as possible. So that's definitely something that really is part of Movability's core mission. So I've lost my dang notes again. We are talking about distance not being a barrier. So a big way that, the most common thing that I hear when I'm talking to people about why, a lot of people that I talk to are interested in active or non-SOV transportation. But the biggest barrier that I hear about is it's too far. Because of people's schedules or their comfort level, or maybe even their physical fitness, it's too far or it's too uncomfortable. And so one way that I would help address that with your employees is just say, hey, what if you parked somewhere and then rode your bike from wherever you parked? So I know that our executive director parks at a Cap Metro park and ride, and then rides her bike to work. You can also put your bike on a bus. Pretty much every transit bus in the Central Texas area, San Marcos, Austin, has bike racks. So that is a really easy way to take some of that distance component out of it. Another thing that I like to do sometimes is I'll drive to work and then ride home. And then you can ride to work the next day and then drive home. So that does kind of tie your car up somewhere, but it's kind of fun too. Once you don't have the car anymore, you've got to make it happen. And then for especially biking, but this is something you can also combine with transit or the park and ride strategy, is if the fitness requirement is something that is a problem for you, e-bikes can really reduce the fitness requirement, and you don't even have to buy one. In Austin, there's the Metro bike, which is electrifying their whole fleet. All of those bikes will be e-assist bikes soon. And then in Austin and San Marcos, there's micro mobility options, some of which are bikes. So you can have a scooter or a bike, and you can ride without having to actually ride an e-bike without actually having to own it. And kind of my suggestion would be you try it out to see if you want to buy one. And this is the kind of conversation that, you would be having as an organization, you'd be having with your employee. Next slide. So just let me tee up here, Andrea. The reason we want to include this is you know, really contextualizing the kind of infrastructure you see around you is going to help you as an organization or employer really encourage people to use active or non-automotive transportation, because, you know, it's helpful to really, if you have a bike lane near you, or, you know, you don't have one, you know, we're going to get into what to do if you don't have any kind of safe municipal or sort of street infrastructure. We'll show you what to do and how to deal with that. So, but Andrea, please.
Yeah, walk us through just some types of infrastructure which you see as you're driving around Austin or even San Marcos. Most cities in our corridor are really starting to kind of implement a lot of this, which is exciting. So just kind of running through the different types of infrastructure from the left to the right. As we move to the right image, we're getting to a more comfortable setting for a bike rider. So first image is obviously a bike lane. This is still amazing because that means I, as a rider, have a place to be. It is creating space amongst the sea of pavement and cars that says that I can ride here. And that also means that I have rights where I am, and that cars have a responsibility to really think about where I am and there's a designated place. A buffered bike lane is the next image, and that's going to provide me even more comfortability because I now have a buffer. Although it's just paint, it's also distance. And for anybody who rides, feeling a car go past you really quickly is a very scary feeling, especially for new riders who are not used to it. I mean, it can be a huge detriment. It's, you feel like you have just watched, you're replaying this idea that if it had been a few inches closer to me, it could have gone really wrong. So this gives you just that distance, and that makes a really big difference. The next image is a protected bike lane, just like a buffered, but the protection comes from actually having physical barriers. A lot of times they might be sort of taller, like this image. These are probably 2 feet tall or so. They typically have reflectors. They're going to be colored. They're actually something that a car will actually hit this, but a lot of times they aren't going to be super a critical hit. You can just run over these and they'll just kind of fall down. But again, it's this a visual perspective of, oh, there's something also now in the way, a little fence, a little bit of that, just more peripheral view of something being in the way of that bike rider. The next image is actually of San Marcos that we're really excited about. We installed our first cycle track. So you'll notice from this image that I am nowhere near, if I'm riding in this, I'm nowhere near moving vehicles in a lane. So to the right of the image is actually our county courthouse and our courthouse lawn and a sidewalk. And then this is actually a 2-way cycle track. So the other images are just showing a 1-way lane. This is actually 2-way. So to the right and left, bikes might be going opposite direction. We still have those physical barriers, those protected features, but then I have parking that's protecting me from the lane. So there's actually a huge both distance and sort of actual physical feature there. And so this is a kind of a first introduction of this type of infrastructure. Since this image was taken, we're also adding kind of more paint on the ground, which in that third image, you can kind of see that green paint. And again, that's just something that it's reflective. As a driver, you're sort of seeing this. I will say that it's going to be a lot of times rare that your employee is having the luxury of getting to ride on any of this infrastructure, just because we're still as cities trying to incorporate those into a very car-centric infrastructure environment. So, if you have a multi-lane road with speed limits that are over 35 miles per hour, and there's no alternative route for your employee to take, it's going to be really difficult. And that's something that, again, you can better understand just through a quick survey of where are your employees coming from? Like, what might their routes be? All of this sort of data for bike infrastructure, it's out there. You can download it. You can sort of see spatially where people are coming from. And so in this case, I think one of the best things that I think you have as an employer and just as a citizen, is you can sort of request additional infrastructure. Like you can advocate on behalf of your employees, or at least give them also options to say, hey, like we would really love this type of infrastructure, here. Just as schools will also advocate that they would really like an improved crosswalk in front of their school. It's sort of that same thing. You play a role in your city organization, and your city government to kind of be able to participate. And I know that movability, you guys have strategies to kind of help with some of this as well. So
Absolutely. And I think just what I've noticed as an advocate, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Andrea, is that if you want something to get done, a lot of times the city doesn't get a lot of input, and they almost never get, I work for a state agency that had a lot of public facing parts, and a lot of our interactions with the public were not necessarily negative, but people were telling us things that they were upset about or things they didn't like. They wouldn't offer solutions or ask for something proactively. So when I was there, I would, when someone would ask for something proactively, it was always sort of delightful, because it's like, oh yeah, no, that's a good idea. Even if it was a terrible idea, I would at least like that they were trying to, be proactive. But, especially for, in the situation where you were trying to mitigate the safety issue, I mean, I definitely always appreciate that kind of input. So I think just to tie up the presentation and really hammer home what we were trying to say is, how do you get involved? How do you promote that active, that non-SOV transportation, that's support multimodal commutes? I think that, because that distance barrier is almost always what I hear is the problem, give employees options and incentives for putting that extra effort in, because it feels like a lot more effort to not drive. If you're riding a bike or waiting for the bus, or even waiting for a carpool, setting it up, or requesting a van pool, it takes energy. And I think that giving employees options and incentives, will say, you should do that as an organization, because it will say it very well could save you money. And it's the kind of thing too, where if you're, you can try it, pilot it, the program for a year, and see how it goes, see how much money you actually save, see if it's worth it. You don't have to, set anything in stone right away. Be flexible with it, because I think that you'll see that some of it, ideas that that you are promoting may not work very well, and that's okay. You just, gravitate towards what does work. As part of that promotion, support active transportation, access to showers, incentives, in building that infrastructure we were talking about, or changing, if you can't build it, or you can't build it immediately, change policies to mitigate the problem while you're trying to find other solutions. Let people bring bikes or electric skateboards or scooters or like e-assist bikes into the office, because if you can't reliably store your bike at work and keep it secured, you're not going to be able to ride it. And I think one thing I was thinking about while we're giving the presentation is that another huge issue with, for instance, a bike rack is you can't prevent someone from stealing stuff off your bike. You can't, it's much more difficult to keep your water bottle cages or water bottles or wheels secure. So, I mean, it's just a problem if you're going to be leaving something that valuable outside for as long as you're at work. And then work with people who control your surroundings, like ask for bike lanes. When you if your current lease for your building doesn't allow you to build, add the infrastructure that your employees would really help your employees, change your policies until your lease is up, and then renegotiate your lease. And likewise with municipalities, if you don't have a bike lane or a transit stop or something that would make it easier for your employees, it doesn't take the return on investment for a request for those kind of things is potentially huge. And the cost, you know, it's just engaging with someone at your building or at the municipality or the local transit. But, you know, trying to make those modifications for your employees can be helpful. And that's definitely in that kind of advocacy role, that's something where you know, management and the employees can work together. You know, you can say, hey, you know, we're trying to work with the city to get this done, but it's taking a while. It'd be great if y'all could send an email too. You know, that's definitely kind of an interesting idea to promote. So that's think about that. And Andrea, what do you think?
Yeah, I think all of those points are good. And you know, I'm that a final piece there. It's like work with people who control your surroundings. You know, I'm kind of wearing my city hat and also an employee hat and a bike rider hat, but getting involved is really important. And I think I always want to stress to people that you have a lot of power to really impact what goes on in your environment. So working with people who control the surroundings is going to be your municipalities or your organizations that are promoting active transportation, if that is, you know, a goal that you're trying to pursue. And I think also this idea that I want to like really hone in is that culture that I sort of keep talking about is you know, you're working with people and your people have needs. And a lot of times what's going to keep them happy, what's going to keep them working is thinking about what their values are and just helping support them. And in San Marcos, you know, it's a minority of people who are biking sometimes, but I think we're also sort of seen and we're heard. And as a city, we're also, it's our job to plan for everyone and also those who don't have access to a car. And so I think really trying to think about the values of your organization and the values of your employees. And a lot of times, like, they're very similar. So yeah, I think trying to listen and create that culture is important. And so I think in San Marcos, we don't have a lot of these formal programs, but just the informality of it is still great. And I still get to see those benefits. And it would be great to have more of these formal things, you know, that Alex is sort of talking about as well. So, yeah.
Excellent. Is that the last slide? So I think that to wrap it up, you know, if there's anything that you thought was interesting, or if there is something that, you know, you have a specific issue, you know, reach out to us, because that's what we do. You know, if you're a movability member, you have access to resources and programming that we provide to you as a movability member. And if you're not a member, reach out to us. We can definitely have a conversation. We're always happy to engage. And I just, you know, since we're finishing up, I really want to thank Andrea for taking the time to be with us today. And I also want to thank Kate for running the webinar in the background. And just want to thank all the viewers who have gotten this far with us, and just hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you all for tuning in.